Right, so I've been making a lot of these chorale videos recently, but they've been quite long, like 1 hour 20 minutes, just me working through an entire chorale in full detail, no edits. So I thought I'd make a real quick one. This requires a little more editing, a little more time, so hopefully you show some love and click the subscribe button down below. Maybe click the like button as well, and share it with a couple of friends who might benefit or just enjoy. I am doing this whilst revising for my upcoming exams, including the chorale exam, so it really helps. Also, your boy got a new haircut. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. With that, let's get into it.
Right, so here's a brief look at the chorale. It's the chorale past paper from 2012. Whilst completing the chorale, I actually make 3 mistakes. I am going to point these out at the end, but see if you can spot them and see how many of them you can spot. With that, let's get started. We start by looking at the key signature, which is either G major or E minor. The first chord is pretty indicative enough that it is G major indeed. The one chord is repeated, but with some naughty little accented passing notes. It's worth mentioning that we probably shouldn't be repeating this in an exam because a doubled accented passing note wouldn't be particularly appreciated by the examiner. It's followed by a 5B chord with the F sharp at the bottom, a D major chord, remember, 5 chord. Bass jumps by octave when the same chord or the same bass note is repeated. It's worth keeping that in mind. Then there's a 6th chord with the 3rd degree of the chord repeated. So the G is being repeated because the G is the tonic of the key we're working in. That's perfectly fine. Otherwise, repeating the 3rd degree of a chord isn't particularly ideal. We have a 3-2-5 cadence, imperfect cadence, and notice how the soprano and the bass line moves contrapuntally in opposite directions. Looking at the next cadence, we can see it's a classic 2-2-1 pattern, so we know we're going to harmonize it using 5-5-1 or 2-7-B-5-1. Taking a brief look at the rest of the chorale, we can see there's only one other situation where this arises. However, it's actually disguised with a little naughty auxiliary note, and this will actually cause parallels if we use the 5-5-1 or 2-7-B-5-1 progression. So we're going to have to do something else there. So for the cadence we're working on, I'm going to use a 2-7-B-5-1. You could very well use a 5-5-1. The 2-7-B-5-1 cadence is a classic cadential progression with the bass line going 4-5-1, the tenor going 6-5-4-3, and the altos go 8-7-5. The tenor and alto line can be switched to fit their ranges in certain cases, but we don't need to do that here. Next, we harmonize the bit before. I'm going to start with a 1 chord as it leads nicely from the 5 chord we ended on before. It's going to be followed by a 5 chord, but make sure the bass line and the soprano don't have open fifths. That's when they're moving in the same direction and the bass or soprano leaps in the same direction as the other. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction, and that's probably better, although still you should probably avoid it. Again, looking at the bass line, I'm following the 5 chord with a 4 chord, and then probably I'm going to go a 1 chord, as the 1B would cause some parallel issues between the soprano and bass. Filling up the other parts, pretty simple. 1 chord, G, B, D, adding in the required passing notes. Passing notes are fantastic to get conjunct melodic lines with everything moving stepwise. So we have the 5 chord with D, F, A. I'm not using the G in the 4 chord in the tenor part there, as there's going to be some parallel fifths. So instead, I'm going to use a chord without a 5th degree. So we're going to have the tonic and the 3rd, with the tonic repeated 3 times. That's perfectly fine. I'm also going to avoid using the C in the tenor part as well, because that's going to cause some parallels, implied parallels. So even if we don't use the passing note there, it would imply that we have a parallel there with the soprano, and that's not ideal. Followed by finally a 1 chord, a G, B, D chord. Add in the final note stems, and we are done. Or are we? I see an opportunity for a suspension, and if you can put one in, it's always spicy. Here we have an opportunity for a 9/8 suspension on the 1 chord. Golden rule for suspensions: prepare, suspend, resolve. So I'm preparing the A in the previous beat and then resolving it to the G in the second beat on the chord. Right, now looking at the next cadence, it looks like a 7/8 kind of progression over there, although it's probably not, because if it was 7/8, the A would have been sharp because it was the leading tone. So it's the B over there is probably the 5th degree of the new key that we're moving into. That means the soprano goes a 5-4-5 in the last 2 beats. So we can either do a 5-1 or a 1-5, so perfect or imperfect cadence, but I'm going to do an imperfect because it gets in contrast to the other perfect cadences we have. So the B being the 5th degree means the tonic is E. It's either E major or E minor. Is it E major? Well, there are no sharps, no G sharp, no C sharp, so it's definitely not E major. It's E minor, and that makes a lot of sense because E minor is the relative minor of the key we started in. We started in G major, and the relative minor of G major is E minor, so we are clearly moving to the relative minor here. So as I decided, I'm going to do a 1-5 here, so going from E to a B. You could do a 5-1 cadence as well, but it's just a personal choice. I'm going to prepare the 1 chord with a 4 chord. I should probably write the chords with small numbers because they're minor chords. That's a very nice bass line there. We have a 6, 7, 8, 5. Now we fill up the tenor and alto parts. with the right notes, I mind you, not like the stupid wrong notes that I put in there thinking I was doing a 5-1, but I'm doing a 1-5. So we end on a B major chord. That's the 5 and E minor. So put in the right D sharps and the F sharps. Do not forget your accidentals. Very common mistake to make. And the next bits are simple. The one chord is an E, G, B, an E minor chord. I'm going to repeat the E because if you can repeat the root of a chord, that's the ideal scenario. If you can't, then probably repeating the fifth is the best option. The third is not ideal unless it's the tonic, as I mentioned before. The parallel thirds there between the tenor and alto is perfectly fine. Parallel fifths and parallel octaves are the stuff we're trying to avoid. And we finish off with the 4 chord, which is an A minor and E minor. I've gone in and filled in the bit before with 4, 5, 1, 6. I used a 4B instead of a 4 to avoid parallels with the soprano. And now the bass and soprano move in different directions, with the bass having a little sequential pattern with the leap of a 4 from B to an E, preparing that E minor quite nicely there. Remember, the 6th chord in G major is its relative minor, so that's E minor, which is the one in the E minor we're moving to. So I've used that as the pivot chord to modulate to E minor. I've also put in a little 7/6 suspension, which is essentially a 9/8 suspension, but over a first inversion chord. So the suspension makes a 7/6 interval with the bass note, which is the 3rd degree of the chord because it's the first inversion chord. Notice how I've repeated the G in the E minor chord there, so the 3rd degree of the chord. This is not ideal, but we're in the key of G major, so repeating the tonic in any chord is fine, even if it's the 3rd. Right, next cadence, we have a C sharp, which is clearly the leading note, leading on to the D, which is definitely the tonic, so the soprano does a classic 8-7-8, with the tonic being D, so either we're in D major or D minor, most likely D major, because D major is the dominant of G major, and that's a very classic and easy modulation. Looking at the previous bar, there's already a C sharp there, so that means we've already modulated to D major before that. Remember, we finished the last cadence in E minor precisely on a B major chord, which is the dominant of E minor, so that leads nicely onto an E minor chord, which is a 1 chord in E minor, but also the relative minor of G major, so the 6th chord in G major, so we can use that immediately as a pivot chord to modulate to G major. Now, G major's dominant is D major, that means in D major, G major is the 4th chord, so we can immediately use that as a pivot chord to modulate straight into D major, which justifies the C sharp, because the C sharp leads on to that D major quite nicely, and then we have a 1-5-1-C-5-1 cadence, which is very nice and establishing. Whenever you have 8-7-8 in the soprano, 1-C-5-1 is a great way to harmonize that cadence. This progression is also known as the cadential 6-4 because the second inversion, 1C chord, is written as 1-6-4 in figured bass notation. This is probably the only place you can use a second inversion chord, though don't use it anywhere else. The bass line for 1C-5-1 goes 5-5-1, so you can either do 5-4-5-1 or 5-5-1. Either one works. Usually you do a 1C-5-1 when the soprano goes 3-2-1, so the alto does 8-7-5 and the tenor would do 5-5-4-3. But in this case, as you can see, that's what I put in there, but that's wrong, because if you look at the last chord, that's a D, D, F, D. You're missing the A, and that's not very ideal. So in this case, actually, the better option is to repeat the 5th degree 3 times in one of the lines, either tenor or alto, and then fix the other line accordingly, doing a 3-2-3 as I've done there in the tenor line. Now we fill up the rest of the bass line. Remember, the 5 chord in D major is an A major, so use the A there. 1 chord would be a D major chord, so D in the bass line, the E minor chord in the beginning, so E in the bass line going up to the G major chord, so nice little passing note there. I'm also using a lower auxiliary on the 5 chord at the end. However, there's something we should be very wary about, and that is, again, open fifths. Look, bass line jumping in the same direction as the soprano is moving in, and we end up with a 5th, so that's not ideal. So I'm going to use a 1B there, doing a da 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 dee da 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 da. That's a very nice bass line, as you can hear. It's got a nice ring to it. However, still we have parallel fifths between soprano and bass, because the passing note in the bass creates the parallel with the soprano. So to get away from that, we can just avoid the passing note, and then we're fine, because the bass is leaping by a third, which is perfectly fine. Now we have da 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 dee da 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 da, which is also perfectly fine. Filling in the rest of the parts, using appropriate passing notes again, alto line, doing a little twiddle around that A and B there. Remember the ideal voicing of the 5th on one stave and the 3rd on the other, with the tonic being repeated, so I'm trying to follow that. However, there are some implied 5ths there. Even though there is no passing note, it still implies that there's a parallel 5th, so we have to avoid that at all costs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the 1st chord, and instead of putting the B there, I'm just going to put in the E, doubling the tonic anyways, and then the G and the B in the upper stave. Moving on to the next cadence. This is the tricky one, because because despite being a 2-2-1, that little auxiliary note prevents us from using 5-6-5-1 or 2-7-B-5-1. It is still a 2-2-1 ending on an A, so we're clearly around the tonal center of A, but is it A major or A minor? We're moving from D major, so it makes sense that the dominant of D major is A major. However, I don't think we can do that, because look at that, there are no C sharp. The C's are all naturals, which suggests we are actually moving to A minor. Now that might seem tricky at first. How do you go from D major to A minor? It is a bit tricky, but then just follow that relative minor and dominant and subdominant route. We start from D major, we go to the subdominant, that's G major. We go to the subdominant of G major, that's C major. And the relative minor of C major is A minor. And that's gangster. That's a gangster progression. However, you can completely do it. It's quite easy to do in this case. As you're going to see, we're going to initially consider that last D major chord we ended up on as the dominant and just immediately move on to G major right there. And that's the first step done. And the G major actually is the dominant of C major, so it's a very classic progression. We can immediately modulate from G major to C major, which is the 4 chord in G major, and the 1 chord in C major. That's the second step done. And then we can immediately modulate right to the 6th chord of C major. That's the relative minor of C major. That's A minor. And yes, we have actually completed that, what looked like a long journey, quite successfully there. Now for the cadence, I actually have a bright idea, and that is using a secondary dominant 7 chord. The secondary dominant is the dominant of the 5 chord of the key we're working in. So in A minor, that would be a B major. So 5 of A minor is E major, and the 5 of E major is B major. So secondary dominant 7 would be a B major 7 over there. So we would write that as a capital 2 because, in A minor, B minor is the 2 chord, so B major would be the major 2 chord. The bass line here is a bit tricky because the 4 chord in A minor is D minor, and if we go from the D to the B, we are having some parallel octaves with the soprano, and if we go from the F, so for a 4B chord, D, F, A, then we're going to have some tritone jumps in the bass, which is completely something to avoid. So instead I'm going to go from the upper F down to the D, so using a 2-7-B there, so secondary dominant 7 in first inversion, and also the D minor in first inversion, and that solves the issues. We have some parallel 6th there, but that's completely fine. Again, remember, parallel 5ths and octaves are to be avoided. Adding in nice little passing notes in the bass line to make sure that's all conjunct, and making sure the D there in the 2-7-B chord is sharp because we're looking at a capital 2, so the secondary dominant is a B major chord with a sharp D. Also, I'm going to make the F passing note a natural, indicating the move into C major from D major. Because of course G major has an F sharp and C major has an F natural. Start by looking at the cadence, the final A chord there. Oftentimes the final chord in a cadence is voiced as a 3rd in the lower stave and the 4th on the upper stave, especially if the soprano ends on the tonic. Remember, the leading note going down to the 5th in the alto line there is completely fine because it's in a cadence. However, anywhere else the leading note should always resolve upwards to the tonic. It's only in a 5-1 cadence that you are allowed to do this. And it is because if you don't, then you're going to end up with the tonic being doubled 3 times in the final chord. Add in the F sharp in the B major chord there, fill up the other parts. The jump of a 4th in the tenor part is perfectly fine. Filling up the other chords, so D minor, D, F, A, we're going to try and repeat D the tonic. However, that's creating some implied parallel 5ths with the soprano. We're going to try and avoid that, so we're going to voice it slightly differently. This does create a gap of an octave between soprano and alto, but that's fine. Do not go more than an octave between the upper 3 parts. Usually soprano, alto, tenor are very close together, and the bass and the tenor have the big gap. But you can go up to the gap of an octave between the upper 3 parts, but that's the limit. Again, we're doubling the 3rd in that A minor chord, which is the C, because we are in C major at that point. We are moving towards A minor, but we're still in C major, so we can completely double the 3rd there because it's the tonic. The E being doubled in the C major chord there has less of an excuse, but you can sometimes do it. It's not one of those rules like parallel 5ths or octaves like you cannot do it, but it should be fine if you do it a couple times. Right, so moving on to the very final cadence, we have an 8-7-8 again in our home key, G major. So it goes G, F sharp, G. We're going to do a 1-C-5-1 again. By this time you should be familiar. This time I'm using the other bass progression. Instead of doing the octave jump, I'm doing the bass twiddle, as I like to call it, doing the 5-4-5-1, and the rest of the parts remain the same, exact same as the other 1-C-5-1 cadence we did. As mentioned earlier, you might see this written down as a cadential 6-4 somewhere, because that 1-C chord, the second inversion chord, in figured bass notation would be a 1-6-4 chord. So we're going to start off from A minor, which is where we left off, and we're going to have to move towards G major. The classic way of doing that is to go to the relative major, which is C major, and then to its dominant, which is G major. The B can be harmonized by the 5 chord in A minor, which is an E major chord. The A would probably be an A minor, so the tonic, which is the 6th chord in C major, so we can use that as a pivot to modulate straight into C major. And the C major chord is the subdominant of G major, so we can use that as the 4 chord to pivot into G major at the dominant key. However, the A over there cannot be harmonized by a G major chord, so we're going to instead harmonize it using the 5 chord in G major, a D major chord, but in its second inversion form, so it creates a nice conjunct bass line there. Right, like that. Let me just tidy that up. Cool. Filling up the other bits, we have the D, F, A there, repeating the D at the root of the chord. Then we have the C major chord. Again, to keep the bass line conjunct, I'm going to use it in first inversion with the E in the bass, but repeating the C, which is the root of the chord. And then the 1 chord is an A minor chord, so we can again use first inversion to create a conjunct bass line. We have some parallel thirds and parallel fourths, but they're fine as long as there are no parallel fifths or parallel octaves. The doubled third here, the doubled C there in the A minor chord, is actually justified because we're moving towards C major, so it hints at the fact that we're moving towards C major. We have the final chord there to harmonize. However, before we do that, alert, alert, we have an issue. The F sharp in the bass there, which is the leading note in G major, doesn't resolve upwards to the tonic. In fact, it goes down, and that's especially not allowed because we're not approaching the leading note from upwards, so from the tonic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the G there in the second quaver beat and leap down to the D. That is called an échappé, and it's a very specific type of stylistic non-chord note, so you'll get extra points for that. Finishing off the last chord, we don't want to have any octaves implied, and that's basically it. Now, as mentioned earlier, there were actually 3 mistakes in there. Let's see if you spotted them. And if you did, let me know down in the comments below how many you spotted. If you spotted all 3, you have a brilliant understanding of chorales. First mistake here is a very common mistake to do with part writing. Look at the jump in the alto there. It jumps by a 7th, and that's a big no-no. You want to jump by 5th, 4ths, 3rds, max a 6th, but you don't want to do any augmented intervals or 7ths or 9ths or anything like that. So instead, I'm going to jump up by a 3rd in the tenor, and that's perfectly fine. We also end up with leaps of 4ths in the tenor and alto after that, but that's fine as well. Next mistake is the classic missing out accidentals. I missed the G sharp in the E major chord and the G natural and the C major chord there, and while playing through the chorale, I realized that the F sharp there, foreshadowing the move into G major, is much better than the F natural. This is why you must play through all your chorales. And the final mistake, well, it's not quite a mistake, but I didn't do what I wanted to. I missed out the 7th in the B major 7 chord there. And actually the 7th, putting in the A instead of the B in the tenor, helps tie in that B major, which is a chromatic chord. It's a distant chord. It helps prepare that B major chord quite well by using a repeated note in the tenor. But this creates a big issue because the 7th must resolve downwards, but currently it leaps up by a 5th, so we have to change something. Hence, what I'm going to do is resolve it downwards, but that does mean that the leading note must resolve upwards as well, so I'm going to put in that little semi-quaver twiddle in the tenors. That's perfectly fine. You can do that, especially at around a cadence, and the tenors get a chance to show off, and tenors always appreciate a chance to show off, and that semi-quaver movement, hence, is perfect. Hooray! We did it! That's it! And here's what the final chorale sounds like.